The sound of a bulldozer rumbling through my morning coffee was the last thing I expected to hear that Tuesday morning. As I peered through my kitchen window, my heart sank at the sight of my great-grandfather's stone fence being methodically demolished into a pile of rubble. Let me share the story of how our HOA's power-hungry president, Karen, a woman in her late 50s with an unfortunate combination of too much authority and too little common sense, decided to take matters into her own hands without realizing she was about to bulldoze straight into a legal nightmare. You see, Karen had been the unofficial neighborhood watchdog for nearly a decade, wielding her HOA president title like a medieval scepter, issuing violations for everything from grass being a quarter-inch too long to mailboxes being the wrong shade of beige. She had perfectly manicured nails that she loved to point accusingly at residents, and a voice that could carry 3 blocks when she was particularly upset about someone's garden gnome placement. This morning would prove to be different though. This was the day Karen's reign of terror would finally meet its match in the form of a very old, very protected piece of property she knew absolutely nothing about. The story really begins 5 months earlier when I moved back into my great-grandfather's house after inheriting it from my late grandmother. The property was a charming colonial-style home built in 1923, situated on the corner of Maple and Oak Street, with original hardwood floors, crown moldings, and most importantly, a beautiful stone fence running along the perimeter. This wasn't just any fence, it was a meticulously crafted dry stone wall built by Irish immigrants in the 1920s, featuring distinctive interlocking patterns and cornerstone pillars that had weathered nearly a century of seasons. The fence held profound sentimental value, as stories passed down through generations told of my great-grandfather working alongside the craftsmen, learning their techniques, and even carving his initials into one of the cornerstones. It was more than property demarcation, it was living history, a tangible connection to our family's past. The neighborhood had evolved considerably since my childhood summers spent there. What was once a diverse community of longtime residents had gradually transformed into a cookie-cutter suburban enclave governed by an increasingly stringent HOA. Karen Morrison, our self-appointed neighborhood guardian, had lived in the area for 15 years and had somehow convinced herself that uniformity was synonymous with prosperity. She drove a pristine silver Lexus, wore exclusively designer athleisure wear despite never setting foot in a gym, and maintained a perfectly symmetrical hairstyle that looked like it required architectural blueprints to achieve. Her house was the epitome of HOA compliance: beige siding, standard issue brass fixtures, and a lawn so immaculate it appeared to be painted green rather than grown. The first violation notice arrived just 2 weeks after I'd moved in. It was typed on official HOA letterhead, complete with a wax seal that Karen insisted on adding to all correspondence, and stated that my fence violated Section 4.2.3 of the HOA bylaws regarding appropriate perimeter boundaries. According to Karen's interpretation, all fences needed to be uniform in height, material, and color, and my stone fence was considered an aesthetic disruption to the neighborhood's coherence. I initially assumed this was a simple misunderstanding. Surely a fence that had stood for nearly a century would be grandfathered in? I wrote a polite response explaining the fence's historical significance and assumed that would be the end of it. How naive I was. Karen responded with a site visit, appearing at my doorstep at precisely 8 a.m. on a Saturday morning, dressed as if she were about to attend a business meeting rather than inspect a fence. She spent 15 minutes photographing the fence from every conceivable angle, muttering about precedent and property values, while I tried to explain that the fence predated the HOA by 60 years. Her response was chillingly simple: the HOA isn't responsible for what existed before our regulations were established, Mr. Thompson. You have 30 days to replace it with something appropriate, or we'll be forced to take action. What followed was a masterclass in bureaucratic warfare. Karen launched a full campaign against my fence, attending every HOA meeting for the next 3 months, presenting increasingly elaborate PowerPoint presentations about neighborhood cohesion and property values. She circulated a petition among neighbors, managed to get signatures from people who freely admitted they'd never given my fence a second thought until Karen knocked on their doors. The violations kept coming, each one more creative than the last. Suddenly, my fence was too high. It wasn't the wrong material, it had always been stone, and apparently constituted a visual hazard for passing traffic, despite the fact that it was on my property line, not near the street. During these months, I attempted every reasonable avenue of resolution. I attended HOA meetings, armed with historical documents and photographs showing the fence's presence in aerial surveys from the 1950s. I even brought in a local historian who volunteered at the county museum, who gave an impromptu lecture about the craftsmanship and cultural significance of such stone walls in our region. Karen sat through these presentations with the facial expression of someone being forced to watch paint dry in slow motion, tapping her perfectly manicured nails on the conference table in a rhythm that suggested profound irritation rather than consideration. The turning point came when I discovered that Karen had been researching contractors on my behalf, or so she claimed. She presented me with 3 quotes for fence removal and replacement, all from the same company, suspiciously owned by her brother-in-law. When I politely declined and mentioned I was looking into historical preservation resources, her demeanor shifted from annoying to openly hostile. The final violation notice wasn't just a notice, it was an ultimatum with a deadline of November 15th, giving me exactly 1 week to comply or face immediate enforcement action. I should have seen it coming. The signs were all there: Karen's increasingly aggressive tactics, her dismissive attitude toward historical documentation, and most tellingly, her repeated references to making an example during HOA meetings. But nothing prepared me for that Tuesday morning. I had deliberately taken the day off work to make some phone calls to the State Historical Preservation Office, something I'd been meaning to do but kept putting off. The plan was to finally get official documentation about the fence's historical status and present it at the next HOA meeting. Instead, I woke to the sound of heavy machinery. Initially, I thought it was the city working on the water lines, something that had been scheduled for our street. But when I looked out the window with my morning coffee still in hand, I saw a commercial bulldozer station directly in front of my property, its blade already biting into the corner section of my fence. 2 workers in hard hats were directing the operation, while a third person stood at the edge of my lawn, arms crossed, supervising the destruction with evident satisfaction. It took me several confused seconds to recognize that the supervisor was Karen, dressed in what appeared to be her interpretation of construction site attire, designer coveralls and pink steel-toed boots. I rushed outside, still in my pajamas, shouting for them to stop. The bulldozer operator, thankfully, hit the emergency stop when he saw a half-dressed homeowner running toward him, waving frantically. Karen, however, seemed less concerned about my state of undress than about what she perceived as interference with a legally sanctioned operation. She pulled out a folder from her designer tool belt. Yes, she had a designer tool belt, and waved what appeared to be official documentation. "Mr. Thompson," she announced with the authority of someone who had just discovered the cure for cancer, "you were given ample warning. The HOA board voted last night in an emergency session to proceed with immediate enforcement. This fence represents a clear violation of our community standards, and frankly, we're tired of your delay tactics." I stared at the partially demolished fence, chunks of century-old stone scattered across my lawn like archaeological debris. 3 sections were already completely gone, revealing the carefully fitted patterns that had been hidden beneath years of ivy and moss. The destruction was methodical, professional, and utterly devastating. As I stood there in my flannel pajamas, coffee mug still clutched in one hand, I realized that Karen had finally pushed things past the point of reasonable resolution. She had crossed a line that she couldn't uncross, and she had no idea what she had just triggered. The moment I saw that cornerstone, the one with my great-grandfather's initials carved deep into its weathered surface, tumbling into the pile of rubble, something inside me snapped, not into anger, but into clarity. I set my coffee mug down on the remains of a fence post and walked calmly back into my house, leaving Karen still mid-lecture about property values and community standards. While she continued her victory speech to the bewildered construction workers, I was already dialing the number I should have called months ago, the State Historic Preservation Office. The woman who answered, Mrs. Rodriguez, listened patiently as I explained the situation, though I could hear her sharp intake of breath when I mentioned ongoing demolition. "Sir," she said, her voice taking on an urgency that made my heart pound, "if your property is listed, any alteration requires explicit approval. We need to stop this immediately. Can you send me the exact address? I'm pulling up our database now." What happened next unfolded like a perfectly choreographed production. Mrs. Rodriguez not only confirmed that my property was indeed listed as a contributing structure to the Oak Street Historic District, established in 1987, but also immediately patched me through to the county office and a Mr. Henderson from the Department of Historical Resources. While I provided information and scrambled to find my inheritance paperwork, they made concurrent calls to the sheriff's office, explaining the severity of the situation. Federal law protects historic properties, and unauthorized alterations can carry penalties ranging from hefty fines to criminal charges. As I gathered documents, I could hear sirens approaching, and through my window, I watched Karen's expression shift from smug satisfaction to confused concern as a sheriff's deputy pulled up to my curb. I emerged from my house fully dressed now, carrying a manila folder that contained something Karen clearly hadn't anticipated: the original deed to the property, my grandmother's will, and most importantly, a certificate of historical designation that had been filed with the county in 1987, 20 years before our HOA even existed. The deputy, a patient older gentleman named Officer Martinez, took one look at the paperwork and immediately instructed the construction workers to cease all activity. Karen, of course, protested vehemently, waving her folder of HOA documents like battle flags. "This man has been in violation for months," she declared, her voice reaching that particular pitch that suggested she was accustomed to getting her way through sheer volume. "The board voted, we followed proper procedures, and we have every right to enforce our community standards." Officer Martinez listened politely to her tirade before responding in a tone that carried the weight of experience dealing with such situations. "Ma'am, community standards cannot supersede federal and state historic preservation laws. This property appears to be protected under the National Historic Preservation Act, and what you've done here constitutes destruction of a historic resource. Mr. Thompson, may I see those documents, please?" As I handed over the paperwork, I watched Karen's face undergo a series of rapid transitions, confusion giving way to realization, realization sliding into panic, and panic finally settling into what could only be described as existential dread. The next hour was a whirlwind of official activity. More vehicles arrived, a city inspector, 2 representatives from the Department of Historical Resources, and eventually, a very serious-looking woman in a navy suit who introduced herself as District Attorney Patricia Williams. It turned out that the destruction of historically designated property is not merely a civil matter, it's a criminal offense that can carry jail time. As various officials photographed the damage, consulted clipboards, and made phone calls, Karen stood off to the side, her designer tool belt suddenly looking like a costume from some tragic comedy. She attempted several times to explain that she was simply fulfilling her duties as HOA president, but each explanation seemed to dig her hole deeper. The full scope of the legal catastrophe began to dawn on everyone as Mr. Henderson from Historical Resources completed his initial assessment. The damaged sections included not just regular fence stones, but several that featured original carved markers, making them irreplaceable historical artifacts. The restoration would require master stonemasons trained in period-specific techniques, sourcing matching stones from the same quarry, now long closed, and extensive documentation to ensure historical accuracy. Initial estimates suggested costs exceeding $75,000, nearly 10 times what Karen's brother-in-law would have charged for a standard fence replacement. But the financial penalties were just the beginning. District Attorney Williams explained, with the calm detachment of someone who had seen similar cases before, that both the HOA as an organization and its officers could be held individually liable for the destruction. The HOA's insurance would likely refuse to cover the incident since the organization had acted without proper legal consultation regarding historical properties. Karen, in her capacity as president who authorized the action, could face personal liability, including restitution costs and potential criminal charges for destruction of protected property. The construction company, surprisingly, was largely in the clear. They had been hired in good faith and had ceased operations immediately upon official instructions. As the investigation continued, more damning evidence emerged. The HOA's emergency session that Karen had referenced turned out to be a conference call with only 3 board members present, not the quorum required for major decisions according to their own bylaws. Furthermore, the vote hadn't actually authorized destruction, it had merely approved exploring enforcement options. Karen had, it appeared, acted independently, using her authority as president to contract the demolition without full board approval. When the other board members arrived, summoned by increasingly frantic phone calls, their reactions ranged from shock to outright anger at Karen for putting them in this legal nightmare. The scene became almost surreal as neighbors began to gather, drawn by the commotion. Many had no idea about the ongoing fence dispute, and several were genuinely distraught to learn about the destruction of what they now understood was a historic landmark. Mrs. Chen, who lived across the street and had been collecting historical postcards of our neighborhood, burst into tears when she saw the damage. "My grandfather helped build that fence," she said, staring at the rubble. "I have photos of him working on it in 1924. Other longtime residents shared similar stories, and it became clear that the fence wasn't just my family's history, it was part of the community's collective memory that Karen had tried to erase in service of her vision of suburban uniformity. As the afternoon wore on, the financial and legal ramifications became clearer. The HOA's lawyer, a visibly distressed man named Arthur Goldstein, arrived and spent considerable time on the phone with the association's insurance company. Their conclusion was unequivocal. The HOA had acted outside its legal authority and would be personally liable for all damages and penalties. The homeowners in our community would face a massive special assessment to cover the costs, likely running several $1,000s per household. For some, this would mean refinancing their homes or taking out loans. Karen's actions hadn't just affected me, they had created a financial burden for every family in the neighborhood. By late afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows across the scattered stones, the official determination was complete. Karen Morrison would be required to pay full restitution, estimated at $75,000 for restoration plus additional penalties totaling approximately $50,000. She would be subject to criminal prosecution for destruction of protected property, facing possible jail time of up to 6 months. The HOA would be fined $25,000 for failure to comply with preservation laws and would be required to implement mandatory training on historic property regulations for all board members. Most immediately, Karen was removed from her position as HOA president and faced potential civil lawsuits from homeowners for exceeding her authority. As the various officials began to leave, Karen sat on the curb next to her silver Lexus, her head in her hands, the designer tool belt abandoned beside her. The magnitude of her mistake was finally sinking in. She had steamrolled over months of warnings, ignored historical documentation, and acted on assumptions that turned out to be catastrophically wrong. Her neighbors, who had once relied on her to maintain property values, now faced financial ruin because of her actions. "I was just trying to maintain standards," she kept repeating, though more to herself than to anyone else. "I was just trying to do the right thing." The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Karen, who had spent years enforcing rigid conformity in the name of property values, had single-handedly created the biggest property value disaster in the neighborhood's history. The special assessment would affect every homeowner's ability to sell, the legal scandal would be a matter of public record, and the months of legal proceedings would tie up the HOA in expensive litigation. Her obsession with a uniform appearance had led to the destruction of something genuinely rare and valuable architectural heritage that could never be replaced despite all the money in the world. As evening approached and the day's chaos began to settle, I found myself back where the morning had started, looking at the remnants of my great-grandfather's fence. The difference was that now I wasn't alone. Neighbors I had barely met introduced themselves, sharing stories about the fence, the neighborhood's history, and their shock at the day's events. Mrs. Chen pulled out her collection of historical postcards, and we discovered that the fence appeared in photographs dating back to the 1930s, including several that showed community gatherings near what became my property. We were finding common ground, literally and figuratively, in the rubble of Karen's mistake. 3 months later, as winter set in, the restoration process was nearing completion. Master stonemason Patrick O'Sullivan, whose grandfather had learned his craft in Ireland, was putting the finishing touches on the reconstructed fence, working from historical photographs and the original stones that could be salvaged. The process had been educational for the entire neighborhood. We learned about the Irish immigrant community that had built many of our historic properties, the traditional techniques of dry stone wall construction, and the importance of preserving historical features that give character to a community. Karen never returned to the neighborhood. She accepted a plea deal that included community service, restitution payments, and a permanent ban from serving on any HOA board. Her house went up for sale just before Christmas, and she moved to a generic apartment complex in a neighboring city, far from historically preserved properties and neighborhoods with character. The new HOA president, elected by a community newly aware of the importance of understanding what they were protecting, instituted policies requiring historical surveys before any major enforcement actions. The fence drama had taught everyone that some boundaries shouldn't be crossed, and some walls are worth preserving, especially the ones built by hand, with care, nearly a century ago.